Hi, welcome to the second part of our lecture on gross domestic product. This time we are going to talk more about measuring gross domestic product using two different approaches. Expenditure approach, we focus on that, and we will also mention income approach. So expenditure approach is about adding all expenditures on final goods and services. Income approach is about adding all incomes received by factors of production. Those two ways of measuring gross domestic product are equivalent. I mean, you get the same results, the same value of gross domestic product, at least theoretically. Why do you get the same, and why is it theoretically? Remember that every expenditure is someone else's income. Whenever you pay some money, that's your expenditure. This money goes to someone, and that's his or her income. So in fact, if you pay 10 zloty in the bakery, for instance, this is your expenditure for bread, and this is the income of the bakery, the same 10 zloty, perceived just from two different perspectives. Hence, expenditure approach and income approach are equivalent, meaning they are kind of the same. Why would you get the same results just theoretically? This is because of the fact that, remember, gross domestic product is not calculated. Even so, we call it this way. We say, well, let's calculate GDP. In practice, it is estimated, not calculated. It is estimated. And each estimation has a certain error. And obviously, when you estimate expenditures that are made in the economy, you make some mistakes. You've got some errors here. When you estimate income, well, you make some errors here as well. So you have some errors of estimation. Those errors can be different. So if you get slightly, I repeat, slightly different results for expenditure approach and income approach, remember, this is because of the fact that your estimation errors are different. Different when you estimate expenditures and different when you estimate incomes. Let's focus on expenditure approach. It's more useful in many cases. So here you can see the four elements, the four components of gross domestic product in the expenditure approach. C, consumption, I, investment, G, government purchases, and N being net export. It would be good to say something important about each of those components. So let's try. Consumption made by households, it is the biggest component of gross domestic product. In developed countries, this is like 60 or even 70 of the whole GDP. So as you can see, if it's 60%, then the remaining 40 would be for the rest of elements, for those three, I, G, and X. Investment is the most volatile element. Investment made by businesses. Investments may change very rapidly, sometimes for no obvious reason. It's just because people feel something, right? Because people are afraid of something. That's enough. Government purchases, this is probably the most stable element of gross domestic product. There is a lot of inertia in government purchases. They are rather growing, not declining. That's what we can say about government purchases. And net export is a funny element because as the only one here out of those four, it can be negative. You know, consumption could be theoretically zero, but it can't be negative. Investment can be zero, can't be negative. The same goes for government purchases. Net exports can be negative. And by the way, net exports has nothing to do with taxes, remember. Consumption. So, as we said, the biggest element of GDP, these are expenditures made by households on goods and services. For GDP calculations, we do not include consumption expenditure on used commodities. Sometimes those used commodities are simply not produced over the year that we are interested in. And even if they are produced in this particular year for which we calculate our gross domestic product, it would be double counting error. If I buy a computer and I sell this computer later to you, this is still one computer and you cannot calculate it twice, when I first bought it in a shop and then when I sell it to you. We count it only once, when I buy it as a brand new thing. The similar reasoning applies to stocks, bonds, and real estate. We do not include them in consumption expenditures. Investment. We've got non-residential investment, which is expenditures made by businesses on new capital equipment. And that also includes changes in inventories. Like raw materials, like semi-products, like products that are ready to be sold, but they are kind of kept in the firm. So changes in inventories are included in investment. Residential investment. This is an interesting point here. Residential investment is made by households. Whenever households buy brand new houses, apartments, they are counted not as consumption but as investment. This is because of the fact that a brand new house or flat is a very durable good, right? It's not like a car that you buy and you get rid of it after 5 or 10 years. A house can be with us for a century or more. So that's why residential investments are part of investment, not consumption. Government purchases, money spent by the government on goods and services. So that would be doctors, university professors, government workers, soldiers, the roads, the airports, bridges, everything that is purchased and paid for, all goods and services. Government purchases here do not include transfer payments. What are transfer payments? Transfer payments, this is, well, my definition, I call it money for nothing. What I mean by that is not that this money should not be paid. What I mean is these are all payments that are not connected with any goods or services produced. So for instance, if your granny is retired, she gets her pension once a month. So she gets money. Money for what? Money for nothing. I mean, your granny doesn't have to produce anything to be entitled to this money. Once more, I'm not telling that your granny shouldn't get this money. What I'm telling is this is money without any goods or services produced. We do not count transfer payments as part of GDP. Again, this is because we want to avoid double counting error. If we calculated the pension of your granny and then we would include her consumption in GDP, then we would count the same money twice. If your money gets her pension, she spends it on consumption. So we capture this money that your granny spends in the consumption stream. Transfer payments are not part of gross domestic product. Net exports. If you think of GDP in the expenditure approach, we distinguished 4 elements. So that was consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. That corresponds pretty well with the idea who can spend money on, let's say, a car that is produced in our country. If we produce cars, then a car can be purchased by your family. If it's purchased by your family, that's part of consumption. It could be purchased by some local business. That would be investment. A car can be purchased for the Prime Minister. That would be government purchases. And this car can be purchased by someone abroad. We don't care whether this is foreign household or foreign business or foreign prime minister. It's sold abroad. So that's exports. And obviously, we can calculate expenditures that are made by foreigners on the goods that we exported. So export would be part of Polish gross domestic product. But on the other hand, if you look at your consumption, then you realize that you include, let's say, money that you spent on your mobile recently. That would be consumption. The same mobile could be purchased by a business owner. That would be investment. Or it could be purchased for some government workers. That would be government purchase. All those three mobiles are probably produced in China. So in fact, they do not belong to Polish gross domestic product. Yet we included them into consumption or investment or government purchases. That would be wrong. We should not include things that are not domestically produced. Therefore, we add additional element to our expenditure approach, which is imports with a negative sign. So the last component of GDP in expenditure approach is net exports, which means we add all the exported things, but we subtract all the imported things. Now you can understand why net exports can be negative. If we import more than we export in the sense of value, then obviously net exports would be negative. Now you can also understand why net exports is not about taxes. It's not about taxes. Net exports is the difference between exporting and importing activities. So this is basically how we handle net export thing. We add the value of exports and we subtract the value of import. Now you can have a look again at the circular flow of expenditures, and we will link it with income this time. Let's start with consumers. You can see consumers on the right side paying taxes to the government, more in the central part, and obtaining transfer payments from the government. Remember, transfer payments are not counted as part of GDP. When we speak about taxes, remember that normally businesses, firms would also pay taxes to the government, and they could obtain some money from the government, like in the form of grants or subsidies. We do not have this here in this graph for the simplicity reasons. Okay, back to consumers. Consumers spend money in the form of consumption. So we can see the stream of consumption flowing, and then you've got additional inflow of government purchases. So the government gets money from taxes and spends it partly on transfers, which is not part of GDP, and partly on government purchases, which is part of GDP. We move on with the stream, and you can see there is another inflow coming this time from businesses. So that's investment. So we've got consumption, investment, government purchases, the stream of expenditures. Then we meet the rest of the world, and this is our net exports. could be positive, could be negative. You can see both arrows here. And then we proceed further on, having full aggregate expenditures included: consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. This all goes to businesses. Businesses sell everything that is covered by C, I, G, and NX. Then businesses produce aggregate income. This aggregate income would go to consumers. And that's how we completed our circular flow of income and expenditure. To sum up, this is expenditure approach, consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. That corresponds with the income approach, incomes of owners of resources. This is income from work being the biggest part in the income approach. Most of the income comes from work, but also that's firms' income, interest, and rents. What is the meaning of gross domestic product? Is it good to have a big GDP? Yes, of course it is. But high GDP does not necessarily mean high standards of living. When you compare different countries, it's not that simple. Remember, gross domestic product tells you more about the size of the economy, but not necessarily it tells you about the individual situation of people. GDP tells you about the size of the economy, tells you also about the income that the whole society gets, the society as a whole. So, for instance, if you compare India and Sweden, you will notice that India's real GDP is much greater than Sweden's. The size of Indian economy is much greater. But obviously, if you look at GDP per capita, which means per head, if you divide GDP by the number of inhabitants, then this big real GDP of India would be divided by, let's say, 1 billion of people. And on the other hand, this smaller real GDP of Sweden would be divided by 10 millions of people living in Sweden, right? So obviously GDP per capita in Sweden will be much bigger than GDP per capita in India, which shows you that standards of living are certainly higher in Sweden rather than India. Real GDP per capita, real meaning measured in constant prices without changing them in the form of inflation, in the process of inflation. Real GDP per capita is considered as probably the best single measure of economic well-being, but obviously it has some limitations. It's not a perfect measure. First of all, it doesn't give you any information about how equally or unequally income is distributed in the country. So if you take GDP per capita, well, this is the average income per one person, but obviously the actual distribution may be very different. So, for instance, you can have a few very rich people and a great number of very poor people. On average, it's not that bad, but if you look at the real structure, if you look at how income is distributed, the situation is much worse. Some elements of our well-being are ignored by gross domestic product. For instance, it doesn't give you any hint about how many hours per week you have to work to achieve the income. It doesn't give you any idea about working conditions. It doesn't give you any idea about the state of the environment. In fact, if GDP is growing, that could be at the cost of great pollutions emitted to the environment, and that would certainly decrease the social well-being of a country. This is not captured by gross domestic product. And also some things that contribute to our well-being are not included. Like, for instance, if your granny bakes delicious cakes for you and your family, this is not included. That influences your general well-being, but it's not part of gross domestic product. You can obviously Google more imperfections of GDP as the measure of economic well-being. But nevertheless, if you look at this table here, it's awfully old actually, but it tells you that, well, those richer countries are usually doing better when it comes to general well-being. You can see there is a link between real GDP per capita and, for instance, life expectancy or adult literacy. So generally, it's better to live in a richer country, richer measured in terms of GDP per capita. I mentioned some disadvantages or imperfections of GDP. So if you want to see something really nice, you can refer to Happy Planet Index or Human Development Index, or a very nice thing which was net economic welfare, introduced by Tobin and Nordhaus. Their idea was that this net economic welfare is net national product plus the value of free time plus the value of non-market production, remember the cake by your granny, plus public infrastructure that makes your life easier, plus private durable goods that are produced and can be used, but minus pollution, minus national defense, and minus work road, and that would be a nice tool to capture our economic welfare. Unfortunately, it is very difficult to calculate such complicated, such sophisticated measures. How would you, for instance, value your free time? Okay, how can you assign value to non-market production? So what is the market value of the cakes that you get from your granny? Okay, these are difficult things. Okay, so this is all what I wanted to tell you about gross domestic product. Thanks for your attention. You may leave a like if you like, and see you. Bye.